When I read the back half of the first chapter of Mark's Gospel, I find myself thinking a lot about Woody Allen. Actually, yeah, the comedian, the movie director, filmmaker. In particular, I think about this scene from one of my favorite Woody Allen movies, from Annie Hall, this 1970s weird kind of a comedy that breaks the fourth wall a couple of times, where the main character, where Woody Allen's character will actually address the camera and talk to us watching the movie, sort of breaking up the story. And there's this one scene in the movie where he's waiting in line at a movie theater and stuck behind this pretentious intellectual scholar who's going on and on about some major scholarly figure back in the 70s, Marshall McLuhan. He's talking about his writings and opinions on this person, and there's Woody Allen overhearing this guy who's just sort of pontificating all his opinions. And Woody Allen goes, "Oh, I can't believe this guy. He's talking like he knows what he is really talking about, but he's clearly not an expert. He's just in love with the sound of his own voice." And in the movie, Woody Allen looks at the camera and goes, "I'm going to do something about this." And he goes off camera and brings on screen the actual person that this other character has been talking about, the real Marshall McLuhan, who then says to this character in line at the movies, "You don't know anything about my writings or my my theories. How you get to be a professor of anything is beyond me," and puts this guy in his place. And then Marshall McLuhan walks back off, and Woody Allen looks at the camera and goes, "Boy, I wish real life were like this, don't you?" I think about that scene a lot when I come to the story of Jesus in Mark chapter 1, because we're introduced to Jesus as somebody who stands out from all the other pontificating blowhards who all spout their opinions, and that Jesus stands out because he actually knows what he's talking about. The recurring refrain we get is, everybody's astounded because Jesus taught as somebody with authority and not like the scribes and the other respectable religious teachers. In the second half of Mark chapter 1, there are sort of 4 episodes that work together, first to establish that Jesus has authority, that Jesus speaks out of understanding, out of experience, because of who he is, and that when he teaches things, when he says things about how God's reign works or what God's up to in the world, he's not just making stuff up, he's not just relying on a theory or a guess or what he heard on the internet, that Jesus actually knows what he's talking about, and that stands out, that when people listen to him, there's something compelling about him. Because one, he's not just shouting his opinion and making people believe he knows what he's talking about because he's angry and yelling about it, but also that Jesus doesn't sort of waffle. He really knows what he's talking about. And as we get these scenes that enforce Jesus has the authority to say the truth, and also he even has authority over evil spirits when he encounters them, the question then becomes, what does Jesus do with that authority? I want you to notice in 4 little episodes that come up at the end of chapter 1. The first comes in verses 21 through 28. First, it starts out with Jesus, who goes to the synagogue in the town of Capernaum, which is in Galilee. Jesus has gone there. And he goes to speak, he goes to teach, right? He's there preaching and teaching like a rabbi would in the first century. So we're not exactly sure how Jesus has begun to get in the notoriety that somebody would invite him, that somebody would recognize him as a rabbi, but they have by this point. And there, as Jesus teaches, the thing that astounds them, they say they were astounded at his teaching, for he taught as one having authority and not as the scribes. And then in the midst of that, there's this man who's there in the synagogue who is possessed by what Mark calls an unclean spirit. It's one of those, I don't know exactly how to describe this, right? Something like a demonic presence, some kind of sickness, mental illness, all of the above. Anyway, there's this person who cries out to Jesus, "What have you come to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? I know who you are. You are the Holy One of God." So if you've been keeping track along with us in Mark's Gospel about who are the people who recognize Jesus and who are the ones kind of dumbfounded, here's the people listening going, I wonder who this Jesus is. He sure teaches with authority. I don't know. And they just sort of leave it. I don't know who this Jesus is. But the unclean spirits recognize him and call out, "You're the Holy One of God," right? You're the one we've been waiting for, in fear, of course, but you're the one. So the demons recognize Jesus. The unclean spirits recognize Jesus. Meanwhile, the respectable religious people don't. But then Jesus, just with a word, casts out the spirit, and the person is no longer possessed by whatever this malevolent presence was for him. Jesus only needs the authority that comes with his word, that only comes with him speaking, right? Jesus doesn't need to take up arms. He doesn't have to do a ritual or perform any kind of exorcism. He doesn't have to, get garlic and a wooden stake. He doesn't have to go through anything like that. And nor does he have to raise up an army to enforce his words. We're consistently presented with Jesus as someone who has authority to accomplish what he wants simply by his word, echoing the way that God in the beginning, right, creates the universe and just let there be light and there's light. This isn't a cosmic battle or wrestling match the way other ancient mythologies tell the story of creation. That God's authority is different. It doesn't have to come by violence or force, but just God speaks and the universe comes into being. God says, let the waters be separated, and over there, and it happens, right? Jesus casts out this unclean spirit and it responds without any fisticuffs, without any fighting, without a sweat or an effort on Jesus' part, but simply at his word. So Jesus has authority. He's beginning to use this in ways not just to make himself a celebrity, right? There's plenty of people who become an expert and then they just become the talking head on TV shows and become the resident expert who's interviewed. But Jesus isn't here just to make himself a celebrity, but rather uses that authority to cast out wherever there's the presence of evil with just a word. So it continues on, and Jesus now goes to, it says, the house of Simon and Andrew, and James and John are with them. And Simon's mother-in-law is in bed with a fever. So, okay, side note here, that means Simon Peter, the disciple of Jesus, has a mother-in-law. Mother-in-law requires having a wife. Boy, that's a fun detail we often don't even think about. Here's Simon Peter, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, and he's already married. Are there kids in the picture? Is there an extended family? It seems like they're probably living all together in a multi-generation kind of a house. So instead of picturing all Jesus' disciples are single guys with no attachments, Peter at least has a mother-in-law, presumably then has a spouse, maybe kids, a whole maybe extended family that he also is concerned about taking care of while being a follower, a disciple of Jesus. Interesting side note. Anyway, they go to this house, she's sick, and Jesus simply takes her by the hand, heals her, and she gets up and feels well enough to start helping put on dinner for everybody. Again, Jesus has authority, and he uses that authority for a purpose for others, right? Jesus doesn't become a dictator. Jesus doesn't become a demagogue. Jesus doesn't say, like just barking orders, making other people do things. Notice from the beginning, Jesus, who clearly is established, has authority, uses it to serve, to help, to cast out evil, and to help people who are hurting. Not to make himself the great one, not to draw attention to himself and puff himself up, but for the sake of others. From the beginning, we're getting to see this example. That's going to be important for Mark, because as Jesus is going to say later on, like, Jesus has come to redefine what greatness looks like, what lordship looks like, what leadership looks like. So we're seeing from the beginning, Jesus has the authority. It's not that he doesn't have it, and that's why he doesn't go bossing people around. He has it. He knows the right way to use authority is not bossing or bullying people around. That's not how real authority works. There's this line I remember from the late British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who said something like, being powerful is like being an elegant lady. If you have to tell people that you are, you aren't, right? If you have to go around telling people how elegant and classy you aren't. People know because of the way you conduct yourself. If you have to tell people you're powerful, you aren't. But it flows from you. It's evident when you have authority that gets people's attention. Similarly, Jesus shows up and by his word can direct evil spirits away and heal people. So then, moving forward, Jesus decides he hasn't just come to grant favors for his inner circle of people that he knows, but the next day, he gets up, Mark says, this is verses 35 through 39. He gets up before dawn, it's still really dark, he goes off to pray. Jesus himself, right, the one who's God's own son, still takes time to go off and pray, like to get recalibrated, recentered. All right, what am I doing today? What am I using this day for? Where am I being sent? Praise. And Simon Peter looks for him and finds him and says, everybody's looking for you. So Jesus says, okay, we'll go to everybody then. Instead of making them come to me, I'll go to them. And as Jesus goes to neighboring towns, he gets to be known. More and more people bring their sick friends and neighbors so that Jesus can heal them, anybody who's troubled by other unclean spirits. And again, Jesus gets this reputation for using the authority he has for the good of other people. It's never, I'm using my authority to puff myself up or to boost my own status. Jesus uses the authority Mark has clearly made established that he has he uses that authority for the good of other people, not to puff himself up, not to make himself a tyrant or despot or a demagogue. And then there's this final scene in chapter 1 that is achingly beautiful. It happens in verses 40 through 45 in Mark chapter 1. And so there's Jesus and somebody who's struck with leprosy. He's got this terrible contagious skin disease that makes him an outcast, right? That makes him unable to live in community with other people. Because at this time in history, right, if you've got a contagious communicable disease, the most charitable thing anybody can do is say, we should contain it so it doesn't spread everywhere else. So the practice was people who got this very unpleasant disease would have to live as outcasts, whether individually or in a community outside of town, out in a community would be with other people who were sick with leprosy. And this guy approaches Jesus, and his prayer, his request to him is simple. He goes begging and says, if you choose, you can make me clean. And Mark says, moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I do choose, be made clean. And with that, he's made well. Now, there's something really important about that scene. And Mark, masterful storyteller, has set it up for us, because in the first couple of scenes where Jesus starts healing people and casting out spirits, Jesus can do it, as we've seen, with just a word, right? Jesus just says to the evil spirit, out you go. Jesus just heals somebody with a word, doesn't need to take hold of them. But he does here. He chooses this person who's been told he's unclean. And again, everybody else's appearance, this guy is unclean. He's got this sickness that could be communicable and could pass along to other people. And Jesus, seeing that this is part of what needs to be made well, right? It's not just his physical symptoms. This guy's been cut off from his life, his family, his everybody. They won't have anything to do with him because he's got this sickness. So Jesus casts out the sickness as well with a word and with a touch. Jesus has taken into himself whatever risk of uncleanness there was. And Jesus isn't ashamed of it. Jesus doesn't say, oh, I'll tell you what, I'll say the words, but I don't want to touch you, you're icky, or I don't want to get sick. Jesus reaches out, takes him by the hand, and touches him to restore his humanity. This is how Jesus uses his authority. Make no mistake, this is an important piece. This is how Jesus uses the authority he has, breaking even the rules, right? The official religious rules. If somebody has leprosy, you don't touch them. If you have the ability to pray to make them well, fine, but you don't touch them. That'll make you unclean. Jesus breaks the rules in order to touch this person and make him well, when he certainly could have, just with a word, just with the sentence, I heal you, you're made well. He chooses to touch him. He chooses to do that as a way of restoring his dignity and humanity. This is part of how Jesus operates in the world. As we're getting introduced to Jesus here in Mark's gospel, we're getting more evidence that he really is who the voice from heaven said he was, right? This is God's Son. This is the Messiah we've been waiting for. This is the Holy One of God, even as the unclean spirits recognize. But that Jesus uses that authority, embodies that role, you could say, only in self-giving love for the sake of others, and not just for puffing himself up. This is the beginning of the revolution Jesus sets into motion, that even the way we use power, the way we use our authority is turned inside out, never about how do I make myself bigger and stronger and tougher and look only out for my interests, but for the sake of others as well. This is the kind of reign, the kind of kingdom Jesus has come to embody. So that's where the rest of chapter 1 goes. We're going to keep inviting you to join us week by week as we work our way through the study of Mark's Gospel here in our Meeting Jesus series, and hope you'll join us next time.